As we move toward 2025, the Ukraine war picture is looking much rosier for Ukraine than it is for Russia. Frankly, the whole conflict is going to get far worse for Russia in the coming year, which could lead to Putin finally being forced to withdraw and negotiate peace with the country he was so certain he would claim easily back in February 2022. The question now is simple. How will the Ukraine war get so much worse for Russia than it already is in 2025? There are several ways, starting with the one that's going to be the biggest drain on Russia as it enters 2025, the stalemate issue. In September 2024, the National Interest published a piece in which it claimed that Russian casualties on the Ukrainian battlefield continue to soar even as the country fails to gain significant amounts of territory. Russia is at a point where it's just throwing more people at Ukraine, with little care for how well trained they are or how effective they can be on the battlefield. Evidence of that comes from Russia's casualty figures, which are exceeding 1,000 per day, with September 9, 2024 bringing 1,150 losses alone. Those figures aren't some recent development. Russia experienced 70,000 casualties in May and June 2024 as it opened a new front in the Kharkiv region, with Ukraine valiantly fighting back against every renewed push made by its adversary. It's clear at this point that Putin is following a strategy of attrition. National Interest claims that he's poured around 500,000 troops into Ukraine in 2024 in an approach reminiscent of that taken in World War I. In this age of modern warfare, we're still seeing trenches being dug out and concerted attacks on Ukrainian fortifications with a combination of artillery and sheer numbers of people as the main weapons. Russia is trying to strong-arm a solution to a battlefield stalemate that has lasted for most of the latter half of 2024. And though the battlefield is in movement, the movement is so slow that the contact line between the two countries has been mostly static since the summer of 2024, barring the Kursk invasion that we'll talk about in a moment. As for the captures Russia has made in 2024, they've come at great cost. The Battle of Bakhmut resulted in the loss of around 100,000 men, all for a small town that offered little strategic value for Russia. It was a similar case for Avdiivka. The loss of this fortress town to Russia represented more a symbolic victory for Putin's forces than it did a strategic one. The war from the Russian perspective has become a quagmire, marked by the fact that for all the resources Russia has thrown at it, the country had only managed to claim 211 square miles of Ukrainian territory by May 2024. The quagmire is only going to get deeper in 2025. Putin has proven himself incapable of changing his strategy, which means he's simply going to throw more men at the problem in hopes that he'll overwhelm Ukraine's defenses. At around 1,000 losses per day, that amounts to 365,000 soldiers per year, with 2025 unlikely to be any different. The Kremlin is already struggling to find soldiers, to the point where Putin doubled the signing bonus for his contract soldiers to $4,651 in July 2024. They won't be enough. For Russia to sustain these losses, Putin will likely have to institute another round of mobilization, all for a war in which Russia is making minimal gains. The stalemate in the Donbass and near Kharkiv is going to cause serious manpower issues for Russia in 2025. Then there's the Kursk problem. On August 6, 2024, around 300 Ukrainian soldiers broke through border checkpoints near Kursk and quickly set about taking territory. Fast forward to the latter days of September, and Ukraine now controls 93 settlements and over 463 square miles of territory inside Russia. For context, that means that in less than 2 months, Ukraine has taken approximately double the amount of territory that Russia has managed to take in Ukraine through all of 2024. That's a major problem for Putin for 2 reasons. Given what we've already discussed regarding Russia's military manpower issues, being forced to divert troops to Kursk is a major drain on Russia's war machine. Putin has already sent 30,000 soldiers to the region, with more likely to come, and every soldier lost to Kursk is one that can't take part in the meat grinders in the Donbass or Kharkiv. Through the Kursk invasion, Ukraine has bought itself time to refortify in the regions where Russia's offensives are most intense. That will only feed into the stalemate issue. Russia now has to divide its troops between Ukraine and its own territory, meaning its progress through Ukraine will be even slower in 2025. In some cases, Russia may even be forced to weaken itself in key areas of Ukraine, creating the possibility of counteroffensives that see it lose some of the minuscule gains it's achieved in 2024. There's some good news for Putin on the Kursk front. Ukraine's foreign ministry claims that the country has no intention of permanently holding onto the territory it seized so far. But that doesn't mean it's going to give it up lightly. It intends to hold it for 2 reasons. First, there's the diversion of troops away from the Donbass. Second, Ukraine hopes that keeping territory in Kursk will bring the war to Russia, forcing Putin to the negotiating table in the process. Russia's president faces a 2025 in which he has to make the tough decision between losing even more soldiers to retake the 460-plus square miles that he's lost in Kursk, or accepting that Ukraine has pulled the wool over his eyes to the point where he has to negotiate. Whatever happens, Putin has lost the initiative in a war that he's controlled through threats and sheer manpower since February 2022, meaning he'll enter 2025 on the back foot and potentially unable to recover. The stalemate, combined with the Kursk incursion, will make the Ukraine war much worse for Russia in 2025. It's going to lose many thousands more people while opening itself up to counteroffensives as it's forced to wage war on its own territory. But those aren't the only problems that Putin will face. The third comes in the form of a new offensive option for Ukraine that has the potential to devastate his strategy: long-range missiles. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has spent much of the war pressing his Western allies to allow him to use the weapons they provide in Russia. He's received that permission in dribs and drabs, such as when the US allowed him to use American-made weapons over the border near Kharkiv. But the one thing Zelensky hasn't received is permission to use long-range missiles, such as Britain's Storm Shadows or America's ATACMS missiles, to strike Russian targets. Until now, maybe. In mid-September 2024, reports started emerging that the UK had quietly lifted its restrictions on Storm Shadow usage, opening the door for Ukraine to use its long-range missiles to hit targets in Russia. The Storm Shadow has already proven itself as an effective weapon in Crimea, with Ukraine using it to take out several ships in the Black Sea Fleet, as well as attacking various ports in the annexed territory. But with permission to use those missiles in Russia, Ukraine gains the ability to hit dozens, if not hundreds, of targets behind the front lines, including Russian ammo depots and air bases. Each of these missiles is capable of traveling up to 155 miles and costs $1 million, with its design being ideal for penetrating the hardened bunkers guarding Russia's ammunition stores. With them, Ukraine can force Putin to pull back the planes he has stationed in airfields near the border Russia shares with Ukraine. The upshot for Ukraine is that Putin will no longer be able to use these airfields to launch glide bombs. These Soviet-era bombs are equipped with special wing kits, costing between $20,000 and $30,000 each, and are launched from behind the front lines before gliding past Ukrainian air defenses to strike their targets. Zelensky claims that Russia is launching around 100 of these devastating bombs per day, demonstrating that they play a key role in Putin's strategy for overwhelming Ukrainian positions. These glide bombs won't be removed from the equation due to Ukraine having long-range missiles at its disposal in 2025, but with attacks on the airfields used to launch them incoming, Putin will be forced to launch the bombs from further afield, giving Ukraine more time to anticipate and defend against them. There's a caveat at play here. Though several news outlets are reporting that Ukraine has private permission to use Storm Shadows in Russia, there's been no official announcement. Still, even if it turns out that Ukraine doesn't have permission, it's also ramping up the manufacturing of its own long-range missiles. While these won't be as precise as those provided by its Western allies, they'll give Ukraine more options in a year when it's already proven it can attack Russia on its own soil without Putin being capable of responding adequately. So 2025 looks set to be a year where Russia has to face even more attacks on its own territory, bringing the war home for many Russian citizens in the process. And it's not just missiles that will cause major problems for Putin as the Ukraine war heads into 2025. Drones are going to be an even bigger factor than they are right now. If there's one thing that separates the Ukraine war from most of the conflicts that have come before, it's been the use of drones. These low-cost, unmanned aerial vehicles have proven vital for Ukraine, as it's used them to surveil Russian troop movements, conduct strikes on targets, and swarm air defenses to allow its missiles to strike their targets. Drones have been vital to the Ukrainian strategy. In 2024 alone, the country has used them to strike over 200 Russian targets, according to Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov. He says, "Today, Ukrainian drones fly over 1,000 kilometers, reaching Murmansk and the Volga region, destroying Russian oil refineries and airfields." Ukraine has mastered the art of the swarm attack, sending dozens of drones to a target simultaneously to confuse anti-air defenses. Airfields, ships, military bases, and control centers have all fallen victim to these drones, and it's only going to get worse for Russia in 2025. Why? Toward the end of 2023, Ukraine announced that it will be ramping up in-house drone production to the point where it will be able to produce dozens of thousands a month by 2024. The result is that Ukraine achieved parity with Russia on the production of deep strike drones by May 2024, meaning it can field as much of an aerial threat with these unmanned vehicles as Russia. It's now building 150,000 drones per month, according to the Kyiv Independent. With this fleet of drones, Ukraine can conduct even more strikes in Russian territory, perhaps even using them to mask the approach of incoming long-range missiles to destroy even more of Russia's logistical and energy networks. supplies will become harder to ship to the Russian soldiers on the front lines, leaving Russia's troops ill-equipped to continue the constant battering of Ukrainian positions. And those drones aren't the only means for Ukraine to strengthen its aerial threat as it enters 2025. It also finally has access to F-16s. The first 6 of the 85 F-16s promised to Ukraine arrived in the country in early August 2024, with Ukraine having already put them to good use, defending against cruise missile strikes. With the arrival of more of the 85 F-16s throughout 2025, Ukraine will gain even more aerial options. It'll be able to better defend against Russian glide bombs and could even use a combination of drone swarms and F-16 strikes to establish pockets of aerial superiority over Russia, again opening the way for counterattacks. The point here is that 2025 isn't looking great for Russia on the aerial front. The country has already failed to make its superior numbers count in this department. Russia has 4,255 aerial assets to Ukraine's 321, and Ukraine is getting stronger as the war heads into its 4th year. Combine Ukraine's renewed aerial prowess with long-range missiles, the Kursk invasion, and Russia's massive troop losses on the ground, and you have a series of headaches combined to give Putin a military migraine. And it only gets worse for Russia. Ukraine has managed to survive the Russian onslaught for so long, in large part because it's received extensive military aid from the West. The Kiel Institute says Ukraine has received over $120 billion from European countries so far, along with $83.68 billion from the US. Putin might hope that 2025 would see that aid dry up, leaving Ukraine in a position where it's less able to defend against his attritional strategies. But that doesn't seem likely. Beyond the potential permission to use long-range missiles in Russian territory, Ukraine is still set to receive a lot more money from its Western partners as it heads into 2025. There's still $85.8 billion in European aid to be allocated, according to the Kiel Institute, which will go a long way toward funding Ukraine's war effort into 2025. That aid will primarily take the form of more weapons, meaning Russia can't rely on Ukraine running out of equipment over the next year. Several countries have also signed long-term security deals with Ukraine, with Norway being one of the frontrunners. In May 2024, it signed a 10-year deal in addition to its current bilateral aid program, which sends a clear message to Putin as the war heads into 2025. Ukraine's allies are in it for the long haul. Therein lies another way in which the Ukraine war is going to get even worse for Putin as we head into 2025. For much of the war, Putin has used threats of retaliation to try and keep the West in line, going so far as to claim that World War III might start if the West keeps supporting Ukraine. He threatened retaliation for Sweden and Finland joining NATO. He said the West would feel his wrath if Ukraine started striking targets in Russia with Western weapons. Most recently, he's threatened nuclear Armageddon over the issue of long-range missiles. But time and time again, these threats have proven hollow, and the West is waking up to that fact. Putin's aggression has already pushed NATO into announcing that it will focus on overarching Russian policy during its 2025 summit. That policy is likely to focus on increasing sharing of information and military strategies, meaning Putin has done little more than bring the West together to focus on him. If you treat this individually, this is Lithuania's problem, or Germany's problem, or America's problem, and we don't inform each other through intelligence sharing and learning from each other, then our response will be basically segmented and less effective, said NATO Deputy Secretary General Mircea Joanna when announcing the summit. So 2025 is going to bring with it continued support for Ukraine at a time when Putin really needs the West to back off. And that support will come with a healthy dose of NATO preparation, meaning Russia has to deal with a Europe that's effectively preparing to fight against it. And all of that's happening at a time when Russia faces a serious problem of its own. It's running out of equipment. The clock has been ticking on Russia's equipment stockpiles throughout the war, claims David Axe of Forbes. As of April 2024, he believes that Russia has just a one-year reserve of the artillery and tanks it's been using to exert so much pressure on Ukraine. Axe notes that superior Ukrainian tactics have led to Russia suffering far more extensive losses than Ukraine, adding up to 15,300 tanks, howitzers, and fighting vehicles by April 2024. Several thousand more have likely been lost since, with Ukraine's losses being just a third of those Russia has experienced. Putin now faces a sustainability problem. Axe says that the Russian defense industry produces between 500 and 600 new tanks annually, with just over 1,000 fighting vehicles being added to that tally. Its problem is that it's losing well over 1,000 tanks per year against Ukraine, as well as doubling the number of fighting vehicles it's capable of producing. That's why we've seen Russia pulling so many Soviet-era tanks out of storage to send into Ukraine, and satellite images suggest it's running out of those too. The International Institute for Strategic Studies research analyst Michael Gierstad estimated that Russia had around 3,200 Soviet tanks still in stock in June 2024, Many of these are likely already decommissioned, with the rate at which Russia is losing tanks, meaning those stockpiles will be exhausted in 2025. ACT says that 2024 has already showcased evidence of a shortfall. Footage exists of Russian soldiers riding into battle on unarmored freight trucks, and in some cases, open-topped golf carts purchased from China. A golf cart isn't going to offer much defense against a Ukrainian drone or artillery shell, but as Russia burns through its tank and armored vehicle stocks, it may not have much choice but to rely on these makeshift vehicles to drive its soldiers around. Visit Ukraine argues that Russia's equipment losses are so extensive that they will force a complete change in Putin's strategy in 2025. The article points out that Russia has also been removing artillery barrels from its older systems to place them on the newer artillery that it has at the front, suggesting a massive artillery shortfall. It's yet another temporary fix, as those Soviet-era barrels, which are already worn due to their age and decades spent in storage, will break down faster than the barrels they're replacing. By the summer of 2025, Visit Ukraine argues, Russia will be forced onto the back foot as it runs out of the equipment it needs to sustain its constant offensives in the Donbass and Kharkiv. Combine that with Ukraine continuing to hold territory in Kursk, and Putin will be forced to face a war in 2025 that's far different from the one he started in 2022. Russia will no longer have the initiative. The equipment it's using will be increasingly outdated as Ukraine continues to receive support from its Western allies. It all adds up to a situation in which Putin may be forced to the negotiating table, not because he believes he can keep the territory Russia has captured so far, but because he's trying to avoid Ukraine pushing deeper into Russia as his military faces an equipment crisis. Let's come back to Kursk for a moment. In addition to putting Russia on the back foot when it comes to its 2025 strategy, the Kursk invasion has had a massive effect on Russia's morale. The country was forced to evacuate over 200,000 people in the wake of Ukraine's invasion. Those 200,000 people have seen a war come to their doorstep that should never have made it into Russia, which has damaged Putin's reputation as a strongman in Russian politics. Putin was supposed to be Russia's protector, the figurehead for its expansion into Europe, and in Putin's fantasies, the man who rebuilt the Russian Empire. Instead, Russia's leader has overseen a faltering campaign in Ukraine that only looks to get worse for him in 2025. Plus, he's enabled the largest invasion of Russian territory since World War II. Why does this matter? The war coming to Russia is already affecting the internal mood toward Putin's fight. In September 2024, Newsweek reported that 49% of Russians now back withdrawing the country's troops from Ukraine. That's a 9% increase in the number of people who said the same at the beginning of 2024, indicating that the Kursk invasion has brought the reality of the war home to many Russians. Now Putin's people are increasingly seeing this war as unwinnable at worst, or at best, winnable at the cost of the lives of many of their brothers, sons, and fathers. Alexei Minialo, who's the co-founder of the company that ran the poll and a Russian opposition politician, says, "The longer the war drags on, the less people have faith that it will end in a beneficial way for them and Russia. That pervading viewpoint will come to a head in 2025, as Russia enters the fourth year of a conflict that it was supposed to win in mere weeks." Minialo points to the Kursk invasion as being a massive turning point on the internal support front, noting that it was a shocking thing for many and decreased the number of those who want to fight till the goals are reached. The poll also found that 63% of Russians would support a peace treaty being signed in 2025, with mutual concessions over continued war. Even worse for Putin, only 29% of those polled said they would support a second round of mobilization. Given the sheer scale of Russia's losses in 2024, that mobilization would be inevitable in 2025 if Putin is determined to keep fighting. Putin's problem now is that he faces massive internal war fatigue. The attritional strategy he employed to sap Ukrainian morale has backfired, leaving him dealing with a population that is increasingly losing its appetite for a war for which it sees no end. That war fatigue is going to prove crucial for Ukraine in 2025, according to Lieutenant General Kirilo Budanov, who serves as the head of Ukraine's intelligence services. Nicknamed the Dark Prince, Budanov says that the merging of several problems by the summer of 2025 will set Russia on the losing track for war. Financial problems, a lack of recruits that they can draft, and they will either have to announce mobilization or bring down the level of intensity of their military actions, which will be very critical for them, says Budanov. The Dark Prince also believes that Russia's defense industries are overheating due to the demands being placed on them, which will feed into the looming equipment crisis Russia faces in 2025. Let's hone in on the financial problems aspect of Budanov's claims. In August 2024, New Eastern Europe published a piece in which it examines signals that Russia's economy is set for a fall in 2025. It notes that military expenditures now account for 8.7% of Russia's gross domestic product, and that Russia faces an unstable future for the gas and oil markets that bring in a huge portion of its national income. About a third of the country's revenue comes from oil and gas, with Putin likely to try and extract more through taxation as he burns through Russia's liquid reserves to fund the Ukraine war. That taxation will be met with opposition. The heads of various Russian corporations are already clashing with Russia's Ministry of Finance over the issue. New Eastern Europe also notes that Russia has essentially lost $300 billion in frozen assets, which the West is likely to use to continue funding Ukraine. Plus, Russia's development fund, which stood at $139 billion in early 2024, is likely to lose up to 45% of its liquidity by the end of 2025, as Putin increasingly relies upon it to find a substantial budget deficit. In short, Putin is spending far faster than Russia is making money, creating deficits while failing to secure any instruments for increasing Russia's revenue beyond raising taxes on what already exists. Putin has already hiked income tax to 13% for people who earn $27,500 per year in Russia, with more hikes incoming for higher earners. This short-sighted approach to Russia's budget issues may help him fund his war for a little while, but they don't solve Russia's economic problems and may even serve to further turn Putin's people against him in 2025. So there's no single issue that's going to lead to the Ukraine war taking a dark turn for Russia in 2025. It's a confluence of issues, all of which will combine to severely damage Russia in several ways. The country is rapidly running out of soldiers as it continues to charge into a stalemate in Kharkiv and the Donbas region. Thousands more Russians will die in 2025 with minimal, if any, gains made. And with Ukraine now occupying part of Kursk, as well as threatening to invade Belgorod, Russia will have to further divide its forces in 2025. That division could create weakness, enabling Ukrainian counteroffensives, especially as the country gains access to more drones, long-range missiles, and F-16s. The likelihood is that 2025 will also bring with it official Western permission to use long-range missiles to strike Russian targets, placing Russia on its back foot and limiting its ability to use glide bombs and keep its troops on the front lines properly supplied. All of the while, Russia will be dealing with equipment shortfalls as it burns through its stocks of tanks and artillery. With Ukraine receiving consistent support from the West, those shortfalls will be cast in a stark light, as Russia either has to mobilize more people, making Putin less popular at home, or reduce the intensity of its attacks. Defense of what it already has may become a priority for Putin as he loses the initiative in the war, with a renewed Ukraine launching more counteroffensives in 2025. Add to this an economy that's rapidly on the way to collapsing and a populace that's less supportive of the war than ever before, and Putin faces a dark 2025. A 2025 in which the tables will be turned and he may be forced to give up on his special military operation once and for all. But what do you think 2025 will bring for the Ukraine war? Is Russia truly in a perilous position, or does Putin have more tricks up his sleeve that will allow him to continue the war through to 2026? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Soviet Collapse 2.0, Putin's Empire Crumbles, or click this other video instead.